Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on this debate, in which we are going to have, let's say, cross views on the US and Europe. We have the privilege to do this dialogue together with some friends. Some of them, it's the first time that I meet you, so thank you so much for accepting the invitation. We have some intervenants from the academia, the institutions, and both from the US and different countries of Europe. So before leaving them to introduce themselves, let me also be precise on one of the participants, Jonathan Wiener, professor of law at Duke University, and also member of the scientific committee of the Climate Economic Chair, who is virtually hosting this afternoon. He won't be there. He's going to connect a little bit later on due to just last minute change in his agenda, but he will be with us later on. So we will have the opportunity to discuss with him some aspects of the Biden administration is really in deep in the details of the legal side of what is going on. So I'm very happy to have you all. I just introduced myself for those who do not know me. I'm an accredited professor at Dauphine University and the director of the Climate Economic Chair. So going on the side of my screen, Claudia.
Thank you, Anna, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to be with you this afternoon on this important topic. My name is Claudia Kempfert. I'm the head of the Department Energy, Transportation and Environment at the German Institute of Economic Research in Berlin, and I'm professor of energy economics and energy policy at Leuphana University. I'm heading a team of approximately 40 experts who are all dealing with the issues of economic consequences of climate policy and energy policy. And we have a focus on the German market, but also on the European market. So I'm really pleased to be with you this afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you, Claudia. Laure.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for this invitation. It's indeed the first time I'm joining, so it's a pleasure. Laure Chapuis from the European Commission. I am a member of the cabinet of Commissioner Simpson in charge of energy, and I've been working in the Commission for pretty much a long time, dealing on environment, climate, transport, and also digital for a while. We are now in the cabinet with the commissioner, very much working on delivering our Green Deal for the Commission and for the EU. So I'm very happy to be here today and discuss this with you.
Thank you very much. So Alan.
Okay, well, thanks so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to come here, and good morning for those of you coming in from the West. So I'm a senior fellow at Resources for the Future in Washington, D.C. We're a think tank, been in business since 1952. I spent some time at the Council of Economic Advisors under the Clinton administration in the 90s. I bring that up because I helped write the first environmental justice executive order. So what goes around comes around. This is such a big deal now under the Biden administration. And also worked on the US first climate change action plan, which failed to get off the ground and get agreement with industry, but it was the first attempt. So these days I'm working on, for the last 10 years or so, on shale, oil and gas issues, particularly environmental issues. And now I have a particular focus on industrial emissions and some in the power sector, specifically working on extending green public procurement to cement in steel and natural gas, working on decarbonized hydrogen and tax credits, working on creating methane markets. We also have a tax credit program for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which I've been working on. And I guess the last thing is inequality valuation. We're doing just starting an effort with Maureen Cropper and myself to try to get into cost-benefit analysis, people's altruistic willingness to pay for reductions in health risks in disadvantaged communities. So I'm very excited about that. So I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks. Excellent. Emmanuel.
Hi, Emmanuel Guérin. I am an executive director at the European Climate Foundation, where I run, among other things, a rather large network on climate politics that brings together a few past and current heads of state and government, ministers, CEOs, investors, mayors behind climate action. And in this capacity, therefore, very much directly involved in some of the European and American green recovery plans and climate policies more generally. So very happy to be discussing this with you today. Before that, I was the special advisor to the French Foreign Affairs Minister and Climate Change Ambassador on the run-up to the Paris Agreement, where I led the drafting team, and along the way in different capacities at Columbia University, as well at Sciences Po in Paris and the London School of Economics in London. So pleasure.
Thanks again. And Patrick.
Thank you, Anna, and good morning to everybody. I was going to say I'm very grateful to be invited back to Dauphine, although we are not in Dauphine, of course, but this is an event organized by Dauphine.
Virtually.
Virtually, exactly. And I'm very glad to say that Dauphine is my university. I'm a Dauphinois, a Dauphine alumni. You know, I got my PhD in economics from Dauphine a long time ago. But you know, having great professors at Dauphine gave me the opportunity to get a very interesting career at the European Commission, the International Monetary Fund, the French Treasury, and after having been gone around the world, I came back close to Dauphine at the OECD, which is located just a few blocks away from Dauphine. As you know, the OECD is an organization with currently 37 member countries, but we also work with non-member countries around the world. So in my team at the OECD, I'm covering countries like China and Malaysia and Vietnam and Thailand, and also have the opportunity to go to Washington a lot and interact with the Council Economic Advisor and the Federal Reserve. Currently, we're helping countries formulate climate strategy in order to achieve net zero emission by 2050, you know, in line with the Paris Accord. So my team, we're currently working with Denmark. Denmark is very interesting because they have an ambitious goal of reducing emission by 70% compared to 1990 by 2030, and then go to net zero. So in a way, they've done the easy part, you know, a lot of offshore wind and also a lot of solar, but now it's the difficult part that's left behind, you know, like methane emission from agriculture. They also use a lot of biomass for district heating, but you know, biomass itself has its own problem. You know, they want to introduce a high carbon tax, but there are inequality issues involved there. So it's an interesting case. So I look forward to the discussion today. Perfect.
So we are, and of course, with such a distinguished panel and different point of view and experiences, I guess that the discussion will be really insightful. I mean, around all of this virtual arena that we are now used to have in our lives, there are different approaches and different discussion going on what it is green recovery. And just proposing you some ideas. I was just looking at in different sources. If one tries to quantify the spending on in the recovery that is supposed to be green, there are different statistics and the first attempts to quantify them. According to the recent studies of the University of Oxford and the United Nations Environment Programme, it has been estimated that less than 20% to what it has for the moment already spent in the recovery can be considered green. I don't go through the figures because I mean they are unprecedented, and even the number of zeros that we have to count starts to be too big. But my question is what it is green spending, and it is just saving the economy or really giving another track. So the question is the same of this report. Are we building back better? And I would like to start our dialogue with this question, and perhaps feel free to intervene, or we can keep the same order of the introduction. So maybe Claudia, so I'm going to start the same way.
Okay, thanks. So basically, I think it's important to have a recovery plan which kills two or at least three birds with one stone, so to say. So we have to invest into the future, which is bringing also sustainability to the whole economy, but also brings the emissions down. And if we are looking at the European Green Deal and also the German perspective, we see that it's not 20%, it's 40%, for at least as Germany is 40% of the investment is going into the green direction. And these are the following, and I would say that's also a fundamental priority. What we need is the first one is investment into infrastructure. Infrastructure into digitalization, infrastructure of load infrastructure for electric mobility, infrastructure also for the public transportation, and infrastructure also for railway transportation. And I would say that's the green direction it should go. And the second one is also to increase the share of renewable energy. So the plan in Germany is really to phase out coal in the next 15 years, phase out nuclear immediately. That's happening this year and next year, and phase out also other fossil fuels within the next 15 to 20 years. And that's a fundamental plan. So we have to steeply increase the share of renewable energy, of all renewable energy, wind onshore, wind offshore, solar, biomass, and hydro. We don't have much capacity, but in order to combine all this, we need digitalization. And this is why it's so important to have investment into the digital infrastructure and artificial intelligence in order to have a balance of energy supply and demand, which is volatile with renewable energy. And here the investments are fundamental. And the third thing is buildings, energy efficiency of buildings. So investments into insulation. We have special programs for helping the financial promotion of insulation of buildings. So the investment here also improves the economy fundamentally because it's helping also the local economy in order to create jobs and do all the work which is necessary in order to improve energy efficiency. And that's a recovery program in Germany, which is really helpful, although we would have been recommended also to have a higher share of green investments than only 40%, so 100% would have been desirable. But anyway, we're also spending into school infrastructure, but digitalization is really a crucial issue. And one final point here to say is that we need a decarbonization of the whole economy. And in Germany, we have a very strong heavy metal industry, so an industry which is really coming from the base. We still have that. I know in other countries there's a structural change going away from the base industry, but in Germany we want to keep that and help the industry to invest into future technology. And here comes hydrogen into play, because we need green hydrogen from renewable energy in order really to help the industry to become decarbonized. And that's I would say the fundamental components of the recovery program right now. And we are in the middle of an election year, I have to say. So now there is a hot debate of where to invest in the future in Germany, especially. But this fits very well also to the Green Deal Europe has in mind, and we all have the same goal: is to reduce emissions by 80 to 95% in the next decades.
Thank you very much. Before asking Laure to intervene, because I mean to give us some clarification on the Green Deal. So my impression is that we should, in fact, is this an overshooting with respect to the previous policies? Because we were supposed to do so, right? So when I say we, I take the perspective of European countries. We were already committed to many of the objectives and the goals that you were citing in terms of greening the economy. So is there really an impetus that comes from the situation that we are living now, or it is just emphasizing or a way to go faster, or the ambition is clearly, I mean, going on a stronger direction? So maybe I'm going to ask Patrick, who has the view of the different countries, both in Europe and also outside.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. And you know, I have to say, I'm very happy that we do this webinar just a week before President Biden invites what I guess virtually. Yeah, yes. I was going to say invite the leaders of the world to Washington, but at least around the screen, right? And I think it's very much welcome. But after many years, you know, where the voice from the White House was not aligned at all with the global climate objective, finally we have the U.S., you know, coming back into the fore, and you know, being ready to work with countries around the world about it. You know, having said that, I don't think we should be black and white, and this is a complex situation. The U.S. obviously is a big country. So when you look at the carbon emissions from the U.S., you know, and despite everything that has been said about President Trump, the situation has got a little bit better, right? In terms of CO2 emissions from electricity generation. You know, for the first time in 2020, the electricity generated by renewable technology, you know, a lot of wind and also some solar, exceeded electricity generated by coal-fired plants, right? So there's the big increase in renewable electricity in the US, which I think is welcome. a lot of action is taking place at the state and city level. So, California is doing a lot, but there is also a cap and trade market in the US, which, the carbon price there is not very high, but they've been trying to get it better. Things have got a little bit better in terms of reducing coal. That has happened because also not only renewable, but natural gas has become cheaper. So electricity now is generated by gas, which is not necessarily an improvement. So I think it's good that the US is being aligned with Europe. You asked a question about President Biden recovery plan, which is very large and has a green dimension. I think it's important to understand that because of the legal situation and the need for a majority in Congress and the filibuster rule, pretty much the only thing that President Biden can do is through budgetary means. So a lot is being done in terms of public spending, and indeed we need public spending, to improve the electricity grid. Things like a recharging station, invest in innovation. But to me, public spending is not enough. What's very important, and I just want to say two things quickly. One is carbon pricing. I don't think we will be able to achieve the goals of decarbonizing the world economy at the current level of carbon prices. In many countries, the carbon price is very low or almost zero. You think of the carbon price of 60 euros per ton of CO2, which is considered as needed, to decarbonize. In OECD country, only 19% of emission is priced at the 60 euros or more. So it's very little. So I think we need to think of what can be done to increase carbon pricing. Second thing quickly is fossil fuel subsidies. In 2009, the countries around the world, they made a commitment in Pittsburgh to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. We haven't made much progress. There's still a lot of fossil fuel subsidies being granted. The latest count is $178 billion in the G20 and OECD countries. It's a lot of tax rebate. For example, in France, if you're a taxi driver, you can basically fill up your tank without paying taxes for large quantities of diesel fuel. In Europe, the common agricultural policy still subsidize farms that use a lot of emit a lot of greenhouse gas emission. So I'm glad that President Biden, in his plan, make an announcement that he plans to remove fossil fuel subsidies going to the oil and coal industry. This is a good step in the right direction.
So we can classify it as a green expenditure or an opportunity cost, let's say, that is missed in the new plan. So, of course, after this intervention, I'm going to ask Alan to say something about it.
So I guess I'll make, so is this, do you want me to get into the Biden plan in some detail now?
Yeah, maybe, yes. Yeah.
Well, let me say a couple things, although Patrick covered a little bit of that territory. In the United States, there was never going to be, under Trump, there was never going to be spending on climate change, on greenhouse gas reductions, except by accident. So, all the economic recovery funds went to individuals and businesses, or most of it went to individuals and businesses who were affected, or in some cases who were not affected by the pandemic. But that series of spending is now over. And so we do have the first Biden bill to reduce CO2 emissions. And of course, we did benefit by the pandemic from a point of view of reduced economic activity that reduced greenhouse gas emissions, but that is going to bounce back unless some work is done. So Biden's American Jobs Act, which is a fairly sketchy plan, actually. If you get into it, you'll see there's not a lot of detail. But first of all, we should recognize that he has a lot to overcome. And the country has a lot to overcome. During the Trump administration, there was a brain drain from federal agencies. A lot of good people just got fed up and left. There's a corrosive effect on cost-benefit analysis, which underpins a lot of our regulatory activity. The belief in science and the belief in good government. The government is a positive force. These are very difficult issues. And of course, the polarization that is pervasive now in the United States between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Trump had to use many executive orders to implement his agenda to roll back greenhouse gas type regulations. But those are easily reversed by Biden, and he's already done some of that. So, so there's a lot to just get back to square one, and that has started. But before getting into specifics about Biden, I want to say that a lot's going on in the corporate community in the U.S. Many corporations want to green up. They've set greenhouse gas reduction and targets and zero targets to get to net zero, movements to get greener production processes. There's also a lot of pressure coming from investment banks and investors and stockholders. So there's a lot that would go on even outside of the Biden administration. We also feel a lot of international pressure. The EU methane initiative, which if that becomes law, and there's actually regulations for that, that'll affect our liquefied natural gas exporting to the EU, clean that up, and therefore clean up the natural gas that's being produced in the States. Public sentiment on climate is very high, very positive. We still have more deniers than any other country, according to our survey work, but that looks good. So there is, a lot that's positive going on. Biden started regulatory turnarounds in two key areas. One is rolling back what Trump was trying to do on CAFE standards, the fuel economy standards. So they'll be getting more strict, and also on methane emissions from oil and gas development. So then finally, I'll just give a couple of words on the green infrastructure plan of $2 trillion. Two things that are difficult about it is there's multiple objectives that this plan gives play to. It's not only to reduce greenhouse gases, but it's also to move people displaced by fossil fuels into the green economy and to be more equitable to disadvantaged communities. So, it's hard enough to get reductions in greenhouse gases. To do these other things, which I'm not arguing or shouldn't be done, but it's a lot. There's also, of course, as Patrick mentioned, these close margins in Congress between Democrats and Republicans. So it really limits the administration's abilities to get like tradable permit programs or climate or CO2 taxes, through the government. So I'll hit a couple of highlights on the plan itself. On transport, there's an emphasis on EVs with battery charging stations, but there's nothing to address used cars. And, used cars stay on the road a long time. And they're all gasoline and diesel burning. There's nothing on trucking. And trucking is going up. VMTs, vehicle miles traveled, are going up. So there's a lot more to go in that area. Green public procurement, there's $46 billion there, but he also includes nuclear for green procurement, like small modular nuclear plants. And that's going to take up a lot of that money if that's taken seriously. I hope it's not taken seriously so we can spread that around to other areas and deal with nuclear in a separate way. The electricity sector, as Patrick said, has a net zero greenhouse gas target by 2035. And our modeling suggests that rate increases could be small if that goal was set at 2050. But for 2035, that's going to probably be a pretty serious hit to the electricity. Maybe not. One thing that I think RFF had a lot to do with is in the idea of capping abandoned wells. So you have all these wells leaking methane and other volatile organics. There's hundreds of thousands of these things around the United States. So if you take oil and gas workers that may be displaced by other policies to reduce that industry, you could take them and have them work on capping abandoned wells. And there's $16 billion for that. So that sort of gets at the jobs and gets at the just transition and gets at reducing methane emissions. There's a bunch of other government funding of demonstration projects in hydrogen and carbon capture that will help that'll be placed in distressed communities. So again, trying to get a twofer there. But as was mentioned, we don't see anything about, and I'm finished here, anything about revenue neutral carbon taxes is not in there. There's nothing about adaptation to climate change in there. So, so this is just the first cut. And in our midterm election in 2022, we'll see where the American public is with this if they elect more Democrats to Congress. So that's my whole spiel there.
Thanks for this overview. So a lot of opportunities, but also some threats. Am I wrong, or you say that the Biden plan is still sketchy, right? Is that the term you have used?
The plan itself is sketchy because it needs some congressional, for many parts of it, it needs congressional action. And so there has to be potentially some degree of bipartisanship, or at least getting in all the Democrats to vote for it. So it's not very detailed. And after all, the administration just started. So there wasn't a lot of time to get super detailed.
So thank you, Alan. I think that the immediate questions that comes is for Laure. Can we define that there is something sketchy in Europe, or the progress is a little bit more, I would say, clear in the sense of declining also the different policies?
Thank you. And I think you started at the beginning by mentioning whether we have a step in building better and the situation has changed or not. And I think there are a few differences with a few years ago, where we set our target, and the Paris Agreement being our goal, is that first we have an extremely dynamic sector. We have clearly, as Patrick mentioned, for the first time, renewables overpassing a certain type of fossil energy, especially coal. So on this front, we believe that there is a trend that has started and is quite unstoppable, we hope, and goes in the right direction. So our Green Deal set the objectives, and I think there it's clear. We also have for the first time a budget which is extremely ambitious, an out of crisis budget in addition, that also put very strong numbers and obligation on our member states. 37% of green investment is big, and we do hope and we see that it's kicking in with the member states coming with plans, whether being hydrogen or electrification, and those elements change from the past. So budget, targets, but also the trend. At the same time, we think that there are, of course, areas where actions needs to be supported by us. We have adopted the renovation wave strategy, and energy efficiency is one of the major element where we need to continue actions, because we can bring in electrification, but as long as energy is volatile, it's also not helping. At the same time, I mentioned electrification. Clearly, our Green Deal is about pushing for renewables. In the system, we have adopted a strategy with offshore. Onshore is also important to deliver our target of onshore wind. We have also sectors that are very vibrant and back in Europe with floating solar, for example, or energy, wave energy and tidal. So there's quite a lot of things coming together at the same time. To accompany this, we have also tabled our climate law, and now coming also with the Fit for 55, and all those elements together brings the right direction. When you mention again, Patrick, the carbon price, well, clearly, without extending the emission trading scheme to other sectors, we don't see the trend moving faster, and that's why we are working on the extension on transport, buildings, where there's a need to decarbonize. The energy sector has done quite a lot of its share, but now it needs to move to the sectors that are still very much relying on fossil fuel. And at the same time, we have also, and that's another part of the trend, we have seen that that the trend internationally is also moving. We are liaising with our partners, with making green alliance or green partnership, and we have started one with Japan, and we will look at our neighbors to build other green partnerships. And of course, the Biden plan and the change in the US is giving us an even more reassuring path. And we think that it has not only recreated a trend between us and the US bilaterally, but the reactions from our partners is also very strong. So we are, I think, having a very different situation. Now, our priorities, as I said, is energy efficiency, electrification, wherever we can, all the sectors that can be electrified, that should be the priority. And for those that cannot electrify or where costs will be too high, we are, of course, looking at the decarbonization of our gas system and hydrogen. Green hydrogen is for us strong priorities. We have accompanied this with Industry Alliance in hydrogen. The Industry Alliance on batteries is already running for quite some time. So that's the important element surrounding our Green Deals, but that's also why we think there is a change. One last element in the budgetary framework, also coming from Europe, and we are in the middle of the discussion now on how to bring this forward, is our taxonomy. So bringing sustainable finance at the core of our policy. Bringing also the decarbonization in terms of looking at the end of subsidies for fossil fuels. Coal is our priority, but the energy transition should be done for all the other fossil fuels, and gas is a big topic. So taxonomy should help us for that, looking at the do not significantly harm as a main concept, where we want to bring the investment forward for greener investment, let's say. So I think that brings a bit the whole overlooking of our Green Deal and why it's so different for us this time, and why we think it is going to work. It will require a lot of efforts, because if we look at our member states' forecast for renewables, we are still at 32%. We're arriving towards 33% of renewable in our energy system, and that's already difficult for the member states. But we are now revising our options for going to 40% by 2030. So everything is on the right path. We just need to make sure that we are all working together for that. I think that I've done the rounds.
Yeah. Thanks for this optimism, and I will have some questions maybe later on a few measures you have mentioned. But before doing so, I would like to ask Emmanuel, which is your view on this momentum? Is this going to, besides achieving climate policies, is this also providing a sound instrument to help the economy from the recovery of the actual crisis?
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you very much for putting the question exactly in this way. You've read my mind, because this is exactly where I wanted to go. I've listened with great attention and interest to what can be said both on the European side and on the American side, and you've got people speaking that are closer than I may be into the detail of European policy and American policy respectively. I can add to this, but I think the view that has been expressed so far largely reflect my own. So what I'd rather do, following your guidance, is talk a bit about the larger international perspective, but very much starting with that relationship in between Europe and the US, because I think it is critically important as part of larger alliances to provide the type of momentum that you are calling for a quite obvious reason, by the way, that sometimes I feel like as a community or as a network, we often forget, yes, the drivers for climate action are domestic, and it's in fact very important that they are domestic, and they relate to many different things. I mean, be it energy security, innovation, long-term competitiveness, local air pollution. I mean, the list is very long, and I must say that I am very pleased to see, not just, by the way, the European Union and the United States, but also China and a few others, fully embracing the domestic driver dimension of climate policy, because this is what was lacking for a long time. I think the way in which the Paris Agreement has been designed around those nationally determined contribution was, at least I can tell you that the intent was precisely to strengthen those domestic drivers, and I think for the past 5 or 6 years we've seen some of that. I mean, obviously not in the US with President Trump, but this is rapidly changing. The part that sometimes worries me is that it's almost as if we pushed the logic too far, in the sense that avoiding the climate crisis, after all, in the end, is a global public good. And if you want the national, but you can also include the business and the investors and the cities into that calculation. If you want the sum of those actions to add up to a sufficient level of mitigation, to be in line with our well below 2 or 1.5 targets, by definition, you need to capture the benefits of international cooperation / competition, maybe. I'm not naive to the point of thinking that cooperation is the only tool that is out there to deliver those benefits. But what I'm seeing at the moment is I think there is no point in denying that growing tensions geopolitically, coming from different places. But my objective here is not to distribute good and bad points to big powers. Both Europe and the US have to make their choices. Needs to be a democratic choice in both the case of Europe and the US, as opposed to other players on the international scene. But what I am seeing is a clear worsening of the geopolitical context that I am not sure squares with the objective of delivering ambitious climate action. At least that remains to be seen, how quickly that can deliver. I mean, there is an obvious play, and to different degrees by, and probably in this order, the US, the UK, and Europe, vis-a-vis China. That is probably explained, is in fact explained for many reasons that go way beyond climate policy and have to do with market access, reciprocity in trade rules, human rights. And so I see, like some of you, that the concept of the compartmentalization of foreign policy, I think this is the term, it's an interesting concept. I think it remains to be seen whether it can deliver in practice, and whether it can deliver soon enough that we achieve success at COP26 in Glasgow, as opposed to a few years later. Because again, I mean, if we are in this very tactical era, I think that's the description of what we're seeing. Don't have to be naive to real politics. Well, every sign I am picking up at the moment goes in the direction of a worsening as opposed to an improvement. Can it pivot quickly enough that those big powers are brought together in Glasgow? That'd be good. I think we need it, as opposed to in 2023, as the Chinese and the Indians and the Brazilians are saying. I fail to see a bit of a common European, British, and American approach to thinking tactically about this. I think there are a few areas that relate more to, strictly speaking, the European and American relationship that I think have a lot of potential, but may not be as easy as it was anticipated prior to Biden and his new administration coming in, and they're related to trade on the one hand and sustainable finance regulation on the other hand. And I think it's two areas where you need Europe and America to work together and be tightly aligned. It's not easy to see, for the reasons that were mentioned previously, around the choice of particular policy instruments that are made on both sides of the Atlantic, which happen to not be the same, because I think everybody understands, at least I hope, that it's very unlikely that the US will get a federal carbon price in the next 4 years. There doesn't seem to be a majority in the Senate for that. But if you're left with investment and public procurement in particular, and regulation and norms on the other hand, to achieve the vast majority of your climate action, and on the other hand, Europe, with its emission trading scheme, a price and quantity instrument that seems to be the basis to think about the way in which the trade dimension is brought in through a possible border carbon adjustment mechanism. I'm just saying that it's two very different things to do it on the basis of a tax or to do it on the basis of norms and standards. And I hope people in Europe and the US, at least this is the very active role we're playing at the moment, understand that beyond the shared high-level political goodwill, the moment it reaches coordination on policy instruments, there are probably a few tough questions that are going to be put on the table. I think the same is true on financial regulation. The EU is quite deep into its taxonomy at the moment. It's been going on for years. The US is catching up on that. I would not completely take it as a given, as much as I would like to see that the US is going to simply mirror the European financial regulation. And yet there is a view in some circles in Europe that it might be the case. So I think those are issues that need to be put on the table, because I think it's very important to build, not naively, on that momentum. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Emmanuel. It's a lot to discuss on what you have said, and in some sense, what you suggest is that we have an unprecedented way to give momentum not only to climate policy, but also to the international dimension on how do we achieve these goals. And potentially there are ways in which some regions, be it the United States or Europe or other big countries, can go towards the recovery by stressing also the national well-being. And this is something that we should avoid. I see that Jonathan is with us, and with all the talk of Emmanuel, I think that you have immediately a way to intervene. And so Jonathan, how are you first? And you may introduce yourself. We have already done the step before you enter the webinar.
Okay, bonjour, good morning. Thank you, Anna. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm Jonathan Wiener. I'm professor at Duke University in the United States, and longtime member of the community of the Chaire Economie du Climat, the Climate Economics Chair. Very happy to be with you in this conference. I'm sorry I could not attend the first part of the conference this morning, but glad to be with you now. I'm not sure where you are in the agenda or what topic you
we are discussing.
Pardon?
We are discussing quite freely on what is going on the, I would say, on the political agenda before our agenda. So maybe a point on the international negotiations and the role of the United States in this moment, in how we can set the process started that is going to start perhaps next week with the Earth Day. It's a long way to Glasgow, but what we can expect from that?
Well, that's good questions, very difficult to predict. And I don't know what the people here in the conference have already spoken about this morning, so I hope I'm not repeating something. Some things that I would be looking for. One is, the United States rejoining the Paris Agreement. Will there then also be an update to the US NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution? And how will that correspond to domestic national policy within the United States? And there are many aspects of the US national policy we could discuss. Let me come back to that in a moment. The second thing on the international agenda I think will be interesting is the relationship between the United States and China, which has been really important, really crucial for the development of the both US and Chinese national actions, and for the movement from Kyoto to Copenhagen to Paris, which involved inclusion of more countries, bridging the old Annex 1, non-Annex 1 divide. So the US-China bilateral relations that included the joint announcements in 2009 before the Copenhagen meeting, and in 2015 or before Paris, and China announcing its first quantitative targets in those years was very important. Now, the United States and China also, throughout this period, increasingly have a competitive as well as cooperative relationship, obviously. And so it'll be very interesting to see how the US-China relationship works out with the new US Biden-Harris administration, as well as the China's 14th five-year plan. So that's a very important relationship to watch. And then a third point on the international level is the other agreements. Besides the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, there are also other international agreements. I'm thinking here of the International Civil Aviation Organization and its CORSIA regime for limiting emissions from commercial aviation. Also the International Maritime Organization and limits on greenhouse gas emissions from shipping, and the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, to the Kigali Amendment to limit or phase out HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, and the question of the substitutes for HFCs. So those are all potentially quite important. And they raise a question about whether there will be more sectoral agreements. For example, could there be, just hypothetically, could there be an international agreement on cement manufacturing? Or could there be some other international agreement on a specific sector, which those aviation, shipping, and HFCs agreements seem to represent a different way of organizing the international negotiations. Okay, on the US national domestic side, I could say a lot, but you may have already talked about that. So
yeah, Jonathan, I went through, how you doing? It's Alan.
Hey, Alan.
Yeah, I went through the Biden plan pretty well. If you have some favorite things, jump in.
Well, okay, thank you. That's great. So I think one really large sort of big picture perspective about the Biden climate plan, and we may be seeing this in Europe and elsewhere, is that if we think, what will we look back on 20 years from now? It just seems to me that we are at a potential, we're seeing a potentially significant shift from climate change policy being pursued through the regulatory power of government, adopting laws and rules to restrict emissions, to mitigate or abate greenhouse gas emissions, from that to the spending, the budget power of government to put enormous amounts of payer-funded money into infrastructure renewal, to a Green Deal or a Green New Deal or an infrastructure plan. And that has different implications for the macroeconomic effects, but also for the microeconomic incentives and for the kinds of laws and rules that are adopted. So a lot of the debate over whether US EPA can regulate greenhouse gas emissions from this sector under this provision of the Clean Air Act or other laws is kind of being, there's some sense in which that looks small now compared to trillions of dollars of infrastructure spending, but with a big question mark about whether what those infrastructure spending plans will actually achieve. There are a number of other things we could talk about, but that seems to me a potentially large inflection point.
I just take the opportunity of asking you something that is in the chat. One from the audience. Is Europe going slower or faster than the United States?
So I could jump in there on just.
It's perhaps more on the European side.
Okay.
I can definitely give a start of an answer, and maybe my colleague from Germany can also add. I think it depends what we are talking about. If I mentioned earlier some of the technology where Europe has been moving fast in the past, and as I mentioned also the picked up of renewables in as being one of the first source of power in Europe this winter. So I think there are things that are moving fast. We have deployed quite a strong industry on hydrogen, as I mentioned, and offshore wind is very much on our priority, and with key players in Europe. Of course, when it comes now to our recovery plan and how to implement them, indeed, it takes time. We have 27 member states with difficulties to go further for some of our member states to fossil fuel, and I think that's where the difficulties hit when at the beginning of last year, when we started looking at the package for the recovery, there were lots of pushback on green investments, and clearly the solution would have been to support the airline, to support airports, to go for more road constructions, and slowly we have worked with them, with those that were a bit less ambitious, and bringing electrification of the car industries, adding more infrastructure. So I think it very much depends what we are talking about, but indeed things are taking time, but we hope that we have quite ambitious plans still.
Perfect. I think that all the European interveners have something to say, Claudia, and then Emmanuel, and then Patrick. And
yeah, thanks.
I will add something too.
Good. Thank you, Anna. So I would completely agree with what Laurie just said, is that in terms of goals and also in initiatives and steps which have already been taken, the European Union is quite ahead of what, if we are comparing it with the US, especially because the US has lost 4 years with a president who was not really active in climate protection. But now I was interested, hearing also what Ellen was describing, is it sounds really promising, I have to admit, because it's really a huge program. For 2 trillion, sorry, is it 2 trillion euro? Sorry.
As I was saying, the numbers are huge.
I'm now mixing, exactly, it's 2 trillion. So it's 2 trillion program, and also the jobs which are related to it. If you can really make it, it brings you ahead. That's, I would say, once in a generation program or investment, which you can do only once in a generation, and in that amount of money. But nevertheless, the European Union has started earlier. They have announced more more concrete climate reduction goals now, also with the 55% emission reduction is really promising. So what's now really under discussion is a climate law, which is still ongoing, and we will see where this is ending, because 27 countries, of course, brings a lot of discussion with it. And now with the pandemic discussion, it makes it not even easier. But nevertheless, we are on a track which is stable. So we are not moving away from this track. And I think that's a good step, even with the Green Deal now, what Laurie just described of investments into hydrogen, renewable energy, infrastructure, which is really necessary. Of course, we need to do more, much more, and Germany is here at the forefront in doing so, and willing to do so still, I have to admit, because it's really driving a nuclear phase out, a coal phase out, and next is a fossil fuel phase out, which is really substantial, and which brings a lot of investments into renewable energy, hydrogen, storage, digitalization, as I already said. So it brings a lot of jobs also related to this. But what we are lacking is this kind of man to the moon investment, which the US is aiming at. We will see whether this will come through or not. But in any case, it's a really huge step forward. So there is a competition, and I think that's good to have this competition. European Union started earlier, now progressing and doing a lot, and the US trying to get also trying to speed up the whole process in a way which really brings a lot of market dynamics into renewables and all the rest of the technologies which are relevant.
Thanks, Claudia. So, Emmanuel, we don't hear you.
Sorry, I was just saying this is proving to be a really interesting and useful conversation. So thank you very much, Anna, for convening it, and other colleagues at Dauphine. To reinforce what Claudia just said, and pick up on some of the very good points I thought made both by Alan and by Jonathan. I think it's important to distinguish in between probably three things: recovery plans, the green component of recovery plans, and climate policy overall, because otherwise we're getting a bit mixed up in doing. Well, I very much agree, by the way, the comparison in between the EU and the US is only interesting up to a point, in particular to make sure that there is tight alignment in between the two to create a broader global dynamic. The way I took the question in the chat, it was very much as relating to recovery plans in general. And this is where I would agree, and I wish I was American at times, not always, but at times, because I think speed is really the comparative advantage of the US compared to the EU when it comes to the recovery plan, even more than scale. And I've seen a lot of the economic and political debate focused on the scale of both recovery plans on two sides of the Atlantic. The truth is that if you add up, the member states plus the European component of the plan, the scales are not that different. But what really matters is that the US is a true federation and that Europe is not. And the speed at which, and also the way in which, by the way, the US is moving on its recovery plan, I would tend to argue, is probably a bit faster after some delay by the US than Europe. For the question in front of us, like the green component of it and climate policy, it's important indeed to get the fact straight. And I very much agree also with Alan and Jonathan. It's a very difficult situation for the US after 4 years of Trump administration. Hopefully it will just have been a parenthesis, but I think all of us understand the underlying political challenges to bring the country together, which is why I'm very happy, by the way, to see that the US version of the Green New Deal very much brings together different components of it, and not just climate, but also the inequality dimension of it, the race dimension of it, etc., etc. I think there is something to learn, by the way, for Europe in this matter. But the truth is that, you know, 4 years were not just lost, but things have been done in exactly the wrong way, and it's a super tanker to shift, and it's not done instantly. So indeed, I mean, a plan is quickly put together to come up with an NDC. This is information that is very tightly controlled, so I'm not going to say too much, but it looks like it's an ambitious plan. I will very much agree with the fact that it looks like what is being prepared is an ambitious plan. The US is lagging behind Europe in terms of climate ambition. That's for sure. Let's hope that it can quickly ramp up. And I very much agree with Jonathan that it's a good position to be in, to not only rely on regulation and norms, but to have the public and private investment component in it to scale up and speed up the climate ambition. On the other hand, and because of the comment put by Alan in the chat, I think this is spot on, by the way. The EU is deep into a nomenclature issue through the taxonomy debate. And for those of us in the trenches, it's not an easy debate. And it's a nasty debate at times. You've got powerful oil and gas interests playing directly in the debate, and those influences are only surfaced when you're having the real nomenclature issue. When you're just doing it through public investment, well, it's a way of not really confronting the tough fight, because you're doing some good stuff, but there might be plenty of bad stuff done on the side, which is why I was particularly calling for tight coordination, not naive to the point that it's going to be an exercise in copy pasting, but tight alignment across the two sides of the Atlantic on their different versions of the taxonomy, which must provide a basis for green and climate resilient investment going forward.
Thanks, Emmanuel. There are a few, as we say, nasty things that we have to solve before going on. Patrick, which is your advice on that?
No, I think Emmanuel put it very, very well. I mean, the question is a bit strange, asking why is the EU lagging behind the US? When in fact the EU is ahead of the US, you know, in climate ambition. I mean, just look at, you know, very simple indicators of, you know, CO2 emission per capita or CO2 emission per unit of GDP. You know, it's quite striking. So the EU is well ahead. So I think the US needs to do more. That's pretty clear. I think Emmanuel said also that the US just lost 4 years. To some extent, it's true. Again, I think we have to distinguish between the rhetoric, which was pretty bad, you know, with pulling out of the Paris Agreement and, you know, weakening EPA, etc. I think the reality is more nuanced. You know, a lot of what President Trump has tried to do has not been successful because, you know, many stakeholders took the federal government to the court. And often the court decided against the president. So, Trump has not been highly successful in stopping the effort to reduce emission. And again, a lot is happening at the state and local level. It's been very striking also that US companies and US banks, and I guess we'll talk about green finance later on, but there's been a big commitment, at the corporate level to do more. But certainly the US needs to do more. So it's great that President Biden has put this package on the table. I think, as Emmanuel and Alan said, there's a huge debate going on as to how green the package is exactly. It's a big package, 2 trillion. There's a lot of things there, as Alan said. We don't have a very good taxonomy or nomenclature to decide what's green or not. So the people said in Washington, the Biden package is not so green. There are many things there. But again, I think it's important again to realize in Europe that President Biden basically can only act on the spending side of the budget. Carbon prices is very toxic, so will be impossible to have a bipartisan agreement on that. Even regulation is difficult for President Biden, to act again because of the court system. So it can take 10 years to push through regulation because the court will be involved and it will take a long time. So because of the way Congress operates, the only thing that President Biden can do basically is through the budgetary reconciliation process, where a majority of 50+1 in Senate is good enough. But anything else will require 60 votes in Senate, which is not there. Right? So the fact that the US is doing a lot of public spending side doesn't mean that Europe has to do the same thing, right? And I think Laure rightly said that Europe is doing a lot on the technology side. I think it's worth mentioning that the European Commission is working hard as well to improve the European credit system. We're going to the third phase and fourth phase, expanding coverage, removing free emission permits maybe. So I think the ETS is going to be very important. So I think the EU is moving. It's not lagging behind. However, I think it's important also to say that EU countries, at the individual EU country level, are not all moving together in the same direction. So if we look at carbon pricing, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, they have done a lot, to cover, significant share of their emission with carbon price. Now, when we go to Eastern and Central European countries, think of Poland, Bulgaria, Romania. It's a different story. Carbon pricing in Eastern and Central Europe is actually still very low. There's still a lot of coal-fired electricity plants, not only in Germany but also, and a lot of coal mines as well in Eastern and Central Europe, and Bulgaria and Romania in the Balkans. So I think the issue of Europe is, the European Commission is doing a lot of good things, but some EU countries themselves, need to move forward as well.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. It is clear that perhaps the impression that the EU is reacting, of course, but maybe it is long, is that some debates takes time, as the one that we have said on the taxonomy. It is something on the table now, this couple of years. We still are discussing whether gas is in or out, nuclear is in or out, and maybe we lose a little bit of time, right? So wouldn't be clear if we leave the banks on one side deciding, or I don't know, this criteria that is used will be in any case used in Europe only, whether we deal with international firms that are, by the way, they operate in Europe, but also in the United States. And then in the United States, they won't have the same limits. And the same is for hydrogen. We have cited it as one of the drivers of this new momentum on decarbonizing the economy. Well, hydrogen or the technologies linked to that they are not new, right? So we were aware of the potential of hydrogen even before the last years, even before the French-German plan. Do we still really have to find not the national, but perhaps the European champion in hydrogen, and perhaps it wouldn't be more efficient to cooperate on that internationally? So and I come back to the issue that we have to go fast, whatever it be in Europe and in the United States. So since we come on these precise measures, maybe if we want to say a word on some key technologies to decarbonize, so I was citing hydrogen, and Claudia was also citing electrification and digitalization. So is that the words that we are designing for tomorrow? Yes, Alan and Jonathan, then. The micro.
Yeah, since I've been working on hydrogen, I wanted to say a few things about that. First of all, I assume people are familiar with the colors. Basically, blue hydrogen is hydrogen produced from the SMR process that use carbon capture, and then green is electrolysis, and maybe there are other technologies around, but in the U.S. that's the main. I think there's a lot of people who dismiss blue hydrogen and want to go to green, but I don't see fossil fuels, at least in the United States, dropping out, particularly natural gas, which is so cheap, dropping out of the picture. And so natural gas with carbon capture, I think, has to be in the picture. And in fact, in the clean energy standard bills that are floating around, you would get credit for natural gas, an extra credit if it's carbon capture. In terms of the tax credits that I've been working on, at $50 a ton of CO2 equivalent for hydrogen, you can get some action. That's enough of a subsidy to get firms that are producing and using their hydrogen themselves, like refineries and ammonia producers, fertilizer companies, to propose projects. But there's a long way to go before they're going to be proposing to subsidize, to have a subsidy large enough to really induce green hydrogen. And with a somewhat higher subsidy on blue, you can get up to 90% if you get the process emissions, and then you also get the heat emissions captured. So more there. And then two more points about low-hanging fruit. One is the blending of decarbonized hydrogen with natural gas. So this could go to power plants, this could go to industrial users, potentially even residential users. That is low-hanging fruit once we are secure about pipeline transportation of hydrogen at, let's say, 20 to 25% blend rates, that's a really good opportunity, and a clean energy standard that gave credit for hydrogen blends would be really good, and I think work. And then the second low-hanging fruit, well, I can stop there. That I think is some really interesting opportunities for moving hydrogen along.
May I immediately respond, because it's really important, Ellen, what you say, because we are just doing a report, a special report for the German, as I'm part of the German advisory board for the government on hydrogen, and we have a completely different picture because we don't have natural gas. We have to import natural gas from Russia. We have geopolitical difficult situations right now where we really support green hydrogen and only green hydrogen. I completely agree with the technologies you have. In the US, it's really a different picture because you have natural gas and you have the technology and you have the infrastructure. We don't. So we are interested in hydrogen. We are interested in cooperations with the US, with Canada, with Africa, wherever we have renewable energy ready to be used with electrolysis, as you say, with to produce green hydrogen and sustainable green hydrogen. So we give a criteria catalog here what we have to look at in order really to reduce the geopolitical difficult situation with Russia right now, because simply we have to import it from Russia, let's face it, because the Netherlands gas supply will decline, Norway as well in the future, because we are talking about now decades. And so we really recommend on hydrogen. It would be a good opportunity for a cooperation also with the US and other countries on green hydrogen. And that was just an immediate reaction to you. I would like to hear the US view on it, because it's a good opportunity to dive into one topic which is really relevant from the European perspective.
Yes, Claudia, I agree that the question is also where goes the demand for gas is going to, which is the perspective for growth if we have to believe in net zero emissions. Maybe, I mean, we have to make the overall picture, right? On one side, yes, we don't have gas, but maybe we do not want to. So we want to be even more independent from that. So it goes together. I think that Jonathan and or Emmanuel wanted also to say something on that. No, that's okay.
Well, I just have a comment more broadly, not about hydrogen specifically, but as we see governments, whether it's in the United States or Germany or elsewhere, trying to promote technological transitions, say from fossil fuel combustion for electricity generation or for transportation towards cleaner energy systems, whether that's hydrogen or electric vehicles and electrifying the transportation sector. You know, we in part, we're seeing the legacy of what we foresaw back in the 1990s or 80s in the economic models of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There were often forecasts of would it be better to reduce greenhouse gas emissions gradually through, say, adoption of a carbon tax or a cap and trade system starting in 1995? Or if we waited, would we then have rising greenhouse gas emissions and then a sudden abrupt drop? And some of those models suggested that it would be more cost effective to wait, and because there would be low cost backstop technologies that would come into play. But another interpretation would be that waiting would result in a rush to switch. And maybe that's where we are now, is that, and there's a lot of concern about what's called transition risk, that if we have massive changes in the economy for a very rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, which may be needed for climate protection, but we also have a lot of disruption involved in that. You know, it's a process of Schumpeterian creative destruction with both creative and destruction, and involving not only private entrepreneurs, but these large-scale government policies. So I think in a way we're experiencing what we foresaw back in the 1990s if we didn't adopt more successful gradualist climate change policies then. So that doesn't really tell us which to choose now, but we may face some difficult trade-offs, at least in the budget allocations between hydrogen, electric vehicles. You know, should we spend hundreds of billions of dollars on electric charging stations across the country, or on hydrogen fueling? Or maybe Alan or others have a better answer to that, but and there may be other alternatives as well.
Yeah, that's true. There's the carbon budget, and then there's also the budget itself. So that we have to reconcile. Is there any other comments on that?
Maybe on my side, just a short comment on this path to climate neutrality and to 2050. Clearly, we chose to go with a trajectory that is goes with the 55% reduction, and then going to the 2050 with gas as a bridging fuel. I think that's pretty clear. So we are trying to bring a maximum of investments in the renewables and green hydrogen, to confirm what Claudia mentioned, that we very much push for green hydrogen, but at the same time we have a time for phase out that is quite lengthy as well, and that's important. So gas will play a role, but we also want to diversify as much as possible. That's why we've been also very much investing in infrastructure with LNG. There's still infrastructure and LNG terminals being built in Europe at the moment. So it's going to be a reality for still some time. So I think that was just my small comment to this discussion.
Thank you very much. We have for the moment, so going to the last topic I wanted to discuss with you. For the moment, we have focused on technologies, as we were saying, with some optimism on climate policy. And there's another dimension that I think also the crisis has made clear. It is the problem of inequality, and how also the crisis has mirrored and made also evident a lot of social problems in our economies. Potentially, we know that lots of measures that we can take in order to protect the climate may have regressive effects. And of course, in France, we all remember what was the movement of the Yellow Vest. And we have seen during this last year that even in, let's say, developed countries, we have issues with poverty, energy poverty, and not only. So how do we tackle also this angle? Is there something that we have learned? Is there something that within this momentum and this ambition that we have explained, is there also something new that we can do on that side, and for improving also the inclusion and alleviating also the inequalities? And this will be our last point in the panel. Alan, you were stating that you are doing research on that, on the cost-benefit analysis side. So maybe I leave you.
Sure. Yeah, I think, one reason that the administration is taking such a heavy hand on government spending as opposed to regulations or taxes, besides from the politics, is if you really want to deal with jobs inequality and CO2 reduction at the same time. How do you do that in using economic incentive mechanisms or single mechanisms? You just can't do it. So you need more of a planning, industrial planning model, which is what he's trying to do. So a good example then, as I mentioned, is demonstration projects that the government would pay for in distressed communities. But as I say, it's a tall order. But one of the necessary elements to move forward on reducing inequality, let's say systemic environmental racism, that's, I think, the biggest concern in the US, is to be able to measure what is going on and how policy will affect that. And so the point that Maureen Cropper and I are trying to make is that people have evidenced in some of our research a willingness to, or a display of altruism to clean up areas that are kind of obvious recipients or targets of environmental racism. So there's Cancer Alley in Louisiana, for instance. And so the idea would be to permit those preferences to be monetized and then appear in government and be given standing, these altruistic preferences, given standing and cost-benefit analyses that would boost regulatory measures that address these issues. And it's a very bold idea. I'm not sure we'll carry it off, but I think it's one component that can, at least an analytical component that can move forward on this issue.
Thank you. So I leave the floor to others. Claudia. Yeah.
We did we did a study for Germany on inequality of CO2 taxes and how to overcome it. So what we figured out is, in order to avoid this yellow vest experience that you in France had, we recommended to spend the revenues of a CO2 tax or CO2 pricing, where you put a CO2 price on fossil fuels and use this revenue back for a per capita climate premium. This is how we called it. And per capita means that everybody gets a check or get a fixed amount of money, 100 euro a year or 150 250, it depends on the price of CO2. So we could really avoid inequality, because it's helping low-income households on the cost of fossil fuel increases. And especially what we see in our numbers, that's in Germany the case, that households with a very high CO2 footprint have high income, and they spend less amount of money for a CO2 pricing mechanisms than a low-income household. So we try to balance, and we could balance it in that way, as Sweden or Switzerland is doing it as well. And we recommended really to take care of this inequality issue, because we are now implementing a CO2 price for transportation and for heating systems in Germany. We started with 25 euro a ton of CO2. That will increase up to 65 euro per ton of CO2 in the next year. So we had to take care of this imbalances, but the German government decided just to increase commuter price for commuters that have to drive between the work and home, and to reduce the electricity price in order to get incentives for eco electricity to be used for the sector coupling within the energy transition. But in order to really take care of this inequalities, it makes sense not only to pay this kind of per capita premium, climate premium, this is how we call it, but also to spend this money. And this is why the US is so interesting, to spend the money really for infrastructure investment, for railways, railway infrastructure, for public transportation, for helping renovation, as the European Green Deal is also intending it. And that helps especially low-income households a lot. The more energy is saved, the more money is saved. And the other thing is that if public transportation is becoming more attractive and cheap, it also helps low-income households. So you can do a lot with this kind of public spending out of this recovery package in order to really to help low-income households.
Thanks, Claudia. And going on the same ideas, Laure, we have heard a lot on the Green Deal, and on the other side, there is also in Europe what we call the just transition. Where do they meet?
Sorry. Yes, we've been working very much in parallel. First on energy poverty, to come back also on this front, we have developed guidance, and at the moment of adopting of our Fit for 55 package, as we call it, which will be our big energy climate package, we are also looking at this redistribution and the impact that such a measure could have, especially if we extend our ETS. At the same time, the just transition is a little bit different because it focuses pretty much on the area of Europe where support is needed because of going out of coal or helping a very heavy industry to move for other source of energy. And we know that there will be this gap for a certain time where jobs will be lost and or might be transferred to other region in the same member state. So we are looking at this fund as a way to help those regions. Sorry, my light stopped, so I'm in the dark.
It's energy efficiency.
Normally I have to wave, but we'll do that later. So everything has to go in hands in hands. We need to support those regions that will need to move to new energies. We will need to support those households that we will see their bills going higher in case of a switch to a higher carbon price or taxation. So that's all those elements are going together. What we see is that our just transition mechanism concept is attracting a lot of attention, especially on the other side of the Atlantic. And we have a lot of discussion and we'll have with the administration and with the energy secretary on how to use the experience of applying just transition mechanism in Europe, but also in our neighboring countries where we helped coal in transition, for example, regions in the Western Balkan or other. And I think that it has very much of an impact also on how to push for the right jobs. We're having a lot of discussion in the context of the just transition mechanism on skills and also looking at how the renewable ecosystem could be a source of jobs for the future. So all those trends are going together in parallel in Europe.
Perfect. Maybe you want to add something.
Yes, thank you, Anna. And as you say, I think we we learned a lot from the Yellow Vest movement, and I think the recovery plans are very interesting measures to help consumers migrate away from, for instance, combustion engine cars to electric cars, right? So I think the goal is to, to change the car fleet and, to help, including low-income people, buy an electric car. So in the recovery plans, there are subsidies to do that. And again, in Denmark, for instance, they reduce the VAT on that. They reduce the registration tax. They also reduce the electricity price for electric cars. So that's one way to do it. Of course, it's going to take a while, for the automobile sector to supply the electric vehicles, for the whole population. So maybe the sort of carbon dividend that Claudia mentioned, would be useful during the transition. I think the same applies to energy efficiency of homes. In the recovery plan, there are a lot of subsidies to help people retrofit and renovate their house to improve energy efficiency and reduce their heating bills. So that's one part of plan. The second part of plan which is less discussed about is the regions where there's a heavy concentration of coal mines and coal-fired electricity plants. Regions that are highly specialized in fossil fuels, which will be hit. And it's reminiscent a little bit of the Midwest in America after the China shock. When China. So when you have a localized shock, we know that there can be a downward spiral. It's mostly, men, low-skilled, old age that are hit, and they have difficulties to move away. So the question is what to do about it. And we have regions like that in Germany, in Poland, in Bulgaria, Romania, Greece. That could be really pockets of poverty and social discontent. So what to do about it is not obvious. One thing I want to put on the table is that the companies, the oil businesses should be part of the solution and not only part of the problem. So it's very interesting to see companies like Total, Elf, Engie, BP, Chevron, Exxon, trying to reinvent themselves as clean energy companies. And in doing so, I think the companies should be encouraged to reskill their workers, right? So if you've been a blue-collar workers in fossil fuel, you can become a blue-collar workers in clean energy. Of course, these are different skills, so you have to be reskilled. But I think the employers have a role to play, and help this process of reskilling and re-employing the workers.
Thanks, Patrick. Jonathan, you have something in the chat, but maybe you want to develop a little bit your idea.
Oh, okay. I was responding to Alan's earlier comment, where Alan was saying that one reason for the large spending programs, infrastructure related to climate change and environment and energy, is that the need to combine both climate policy and also job creation, and also the issues of justice and combating structural racism. And so I was saying that's a good point. And then I was also noting that in addition to the advocates for jobs and combating structural racism, which may be more on the what we call the progressive side of American politics, we're also seeing advocates who previously might have been more skeptical of industrial policy, of government-led transformations or government-led competition with other countries. We're also seeing some of those analysts and scholars sound more favorable to that kind of industrial policy. And I just mentioned one example, which is John Graham, a friend and colleague of ours, who was the the head of the regulatory oversight body in the United States during the George W. Bush administration from 2001 to 2006, but a longtime professor at Harvard and Indiana University. And he has a new book on electric vehicles and an article on electric vehicles, essentially saying that the United States has fallen behind on electric vehicles because it has not had an effective enough industrial policy. He may not use that phrase, industrial policy, but an effective enough government-led program to promote electric vehicles, not only expensive electric vehicles, but lower priced electric vehicles that the mass market would adopt more quickly. So that was just one example.
Thank you, Jonathan. Emmanuel, just to perhaps give some final thoughts. Do you think that in this dimension of inclusive policies, there's a strong role for citizen action? Is this one of the drivers, one of the solutions?
Got a talent for reading my mind. No, listen, and it's a very important and big issue, if not the most important issue for the future of climate action and the ambition of it, because it's a condition for it as far as I can see. There are many different dimensions to it, and we've got 0 minutes to talk about it. But instead of making long sentences, let me just, apologies for that, but dump a few bullet points on you, indeed, and a few buzzwords. I very much agree with everything that was said before, by the way, and I think it's, in fact, critically important. And I think it has an implication for those either contributing or attending the conference, doing research and analysis. I think it's important to not get sucked into the idea of addressing the inequality issue in the context of looking at climate policy design instrument one by one. It's a very important issue that needs to be prioritized much further than it's been the case so far. As I said, I think the American approach to it is a very interesting one as far as I'm concerned. I'm pleased to see that the American version of the Green Deal in a way is a bit more political. I would say that the European version of it and the European version of it, I think, needs to be brought home from Brussels to the member states, to the regions, to not just the cities, but the rural areas. And we're working on that with many of you. Very important to look at the Green Deal as a type of new social contract and not just a package of climate policy instruments. Otherwise, that's going to be a dead end. And there are a few approaches to do this. And indeed, I think citizen participation, deliberative democracy, which is different from direct democracy, is one of those tools. It is not a silver bullet. You will know that our CEO, Laurence Toubiana, is the co-chair of the Citizens Assembly in France. That came as one response to the Yellow Vest movement, again, as part of a larger political package. Everybody who follows French politics know that it's not an easy job to translate those recommendations into either legislation or decrees. But I think what we've seen through this is that when citizens are informed by experts, and the 150 citizens who took part in it, lots of them cried at the end of the first session when they heard what probably people attending this conference would consider to be very basic knowledge on climate change, what to do about it, etc., etc. But they were telling us it's the first time that we're hearing the story like this in a comprehensive and articulated way, which I thought was very surprising because we're all in the business of telling that story all the time, but it was a very humbling, as far as I'm concerned, reaction on the basis of how they reacted. And they came up with completely different solutions to how to address jointly the social issues together with the environmental issues, which are not necessarily coming up just from the climate policy experts. Let me put it like this. And so I think it's very important to embrace that and to consider that the role of science, analysis, expertise is to inform that public debate and that citizens debate, not dictate the conclusion of it, but truly empower the people who are, at least as I can see, asking for only one thing, which is to take action. So that will be my last word.
And I think it will be the last word of this webinar, take action, and we will do that. I think that each of us has a different scope, different arena in the academia, in the institutions, and unfortunately we are short of time, and thanks also to the audience for staying with us during these 2 hours that were very fast and very quick. And thank you everybody, and stay healthy, and maybe we will meet again in 1 year to see the progress we have done until then. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Anna.
Thank you.